Communication is a very human thing. Just look around me. We couldn't be the kinds of creatures we are without communication. Formulating opinions and wanting to express those most important to us is second nature. This makes it easy for us to think that we're entitled to say whatever we like, whenever we like, that we have freedom of speech. But there are many cases in which there are moral reasons to limit this freedom. Let's talk to Robert Simpson about this. Free expression happens.
Thank you, yeah, it's vibrant.
Looking forward to hearing.
If someone's defending a particular point of view and someone comes along and says, I don't think you should say what you're saying there, I think what you're saying is false, or I think what you're saying is really hurtful, or what you're saying is unintelligible, it makes no sense. And if all that person has to say in defence of themselves is, but it's my right to free speech, that's true as far as it goes. But there's lots of things that we have a right to do that, all things considered, we probably shouldn't do. If you betray your dearest, oldest friend and someone comes along to you and says, Dan, what have you done? You've done a terrible thing, you've betrayed your friends, and you just say, well, it's my legal right to betray my friends, someone's going to think that you're missing the point of what they were saying. Even if it's true that it's your legal right, there are other kinds of moral, social considerations to take into account, other bases on which your act could be judged as a bad one or an imperfect one.
I asked Robert Simpson for some examples of when the exercise of free speech becomes morally problematic.
If you're constantly knocking on your neighbour's door and trying to convert them to your religion, every day, relentlessly, the sort of sense of psychological toil and they get worried about, answering the front door all the time, becomes such a burden to them that as much as it's good for you to be able to evangelise and share your religious views, their psychological well-being needs to be taken into account as well. So there are various kinds of communicative actions, like harassment, vandalism, threats, various kinds of false advice. Like if you're a doctor and someone says, oh, what treatment should I get for this illness? And you advise them to follow some treatment that's actually really dangerous and untested. Someone comes along afterwards and says, you shouldn't have given that person bad advice. And the doctor says, it's my freedom of speech to advise people however I like. Well, again, we're going to think that whatever that freedom should amount to, there are considerations on the other side, ways that sort of communication can be harmful or damaging to the person who's on the receiving end of it that outweigh that case for freedom.
It seems clear that a doctor shouldn't be allowed to give you bad advice just because they feel like it. An evangelist shouldn't be allowed to harass you with their ideas. But if free speech causes harm so easily, then why allow it at all? What's the point of it? I asked Caroline West what she thought about this.
I think you're absolutely right that a lot of people think that the point of free speech is to allow people to, say whatever they want to say. And they don't have to defend what they say. They don't have to engage with replies or objections to what they've said. And in fact, I think some people think that, if they're challenged in that way, that somehow their free speech has been interfered with. And I think that is not the right way to think about free speech. We think about it as a conversation, a respectful conversation, where we try and engage with each other and the reasons behind our views. Some philosophers, I suspect, will think, well, this is kind of the philosophy seminar view of how speech is supposed to work. It's supposed to be this kind of rational interchange of ideas. That seems a far cry from the way in which a lot of public conversations go. I think that's true, but I still think that's an ideal, the ideal of being open-minded, listening respectfully to points of view which you agree with and points of view which you disagree with, and trying to really take seriously the reasons that people are offering in support of their view.
Part of Caroline West's point is that critiquing someone's position is not the same as censoring it. That's a really important distinction. When someone disagrees with what you say, doesn't mean that they're violating your right to say it. Speech isn't just words, but all kinds of human communication. Just look around me at this graffiti. Much of it communicates an idea and counts as speech. But what about other kinds of speech, like pornography, for example? Should it be defended in the name of free speech, as some of its supporters claim?
Some want to say, look, pornography, especially violent pornography, it's not really a form of speech, it should be seen more like a sex aid. You know, it's not in the business of communicating ideas to consumers. It's in the business of kind of arousing them sexually, and so you should think of it more like a sex toy than a piece of expression. And I think there's some, you know, merit to that view. Other times, pornography does seem to sort of contain ideas, especially kind of written sorts of pornography. So some are very worried about the content of the ideas that it contains and communicates, especially when you're thinking about pornography, say, that depicts women enjoying rape or sort of saying no, but eventually, you know, succumbing. So some people think that pornography communicates ideas, and they're kind of very dangerous ideas in a way.
It's not really disputed that speech can harm people and that it can do so because of its content. This makes censorship seem attractive, but we need to make sure that we don't censor legitimate instances of speech. In Australia, we currently censor the really violent video games, those that depict rape and drug use. But there's a danger that censorship could go too far.
I think there are probably good reasons to think that some kinds of video games have some kinds of influence on people's attitudes and behaviours, right? Various militaries use video game training simulators as a way of preparing soldiers for being on the battlefield. They wouldn't do that if they didn't think, for good reasons, that it had some sort of influence on their behaviour and attitude and so on. So that gives us at least a starting point, a reason to think that these sorts of things could exert a bad influence. However, we also have really good reasons to approach that hypothesis with a sort of sceptical mood, right? Because every authoritarian repressive government that's ever argued for suppressing a film or suppressing a piece of literature or suppressing some sort of iconoclastic theatre has made a similar argument. They've talked about the way that this sort of artistic behaviour exerts a corrupting influence on the citizenry or upon children or upon some kind of social group. Often those claims are made without evidence, but even where some...
So there we have an example of someone exercising their freedom of speech to say something morally objectionable. He used abusive language towards women that first bombed onto TV in 2014. It's a good example of someone expressing an idea, but he wasn't trying to do anything good, and he definitely wasn't going to stick around and defend what he'd said. We've talked about the harm that speech can cause. In the case of the doctor giving bad advice, the harm seems clear. You might die. In other cases, the harms are more social. They're not confined to specific individuals. For example, racist and sexist speech might degrade the status of the whole targeted group.
Part of what I've argued in some of my work is that when we think about whether considerations of free speech support protecting this kind of speech, we shouldn't just think about the kind of cost to speakers of not being able to make racist jokes. We should also think about the costs to members of the group who are targeted, who might be less likely themselves to speak as a result of being so targeted. They might sort of feel intimidated, or when they do speak, the kind of stereotypes encouraged by the making of racist jokes might mean that other people don't take what they have to say seriously, or don't listen to it, or don't pay it any attention. When you think about why free speech is a value, it's a value because most people think, you know, it promotes truth, it promotes knowledge and so forth. So I think if you've got speech that causes people, you know, to put their fingers in their ears, or the kind of metaphorical equivalent of that, then that speech, you know, there might be a free speech reason to not let people make speech of that kind.
The point is that regulating speech doesn't have to amount to fully blown censorship. We should try to regulate speech, but in ways that facilitate and preserve systems of productive exchange, in which all participants have equal status. Trouble is, how are we going to do this in a changing world of information?
There's an intellectual silo effect where people will first of all get their news from social media, which might be inaccurate, but also where people have started listening only to people who share their opinions. And that, I think, is disastrous so far as the values of free speech are concerned. Mill had a lovely phrase. He said, look, even if the beliefs that you hold in your little silo happen to be true, they'll become true dogma for you, just dead dogma. The ideas will be dead if they lose the kind of collision with opposing ideas that makes them vivid and lively. So Mill thought it was very important that we can give reasons for our opinions, and the thing that keeps you on your toes in terms of being able to give reasons is kind of having to defend them, at least now and then, from rival views. So I think the silo effect in social media is very worrying.
A core question is this one. How well can you actually defend your position rather than just say it? And can you listen openly to the views of others? In order to do this, you need to learn more about what other perspectives are around. Break out of your silo. Maybe read a website that you wouldn't normally read. Listen to a podcast that you know you won't agree with. That way, you'll get better at understanding your own position and the position held by whoever might disagree with you. And you might find you get better at arguing for your own views as well. And maybe you take one or two ideas from your opponent to use as your own. What do you think? Next time, are our bodies really our own?